The sun was a harsh, relentless eye in a bleached sky. The wind was a dry, rasping whisper, the sound of bones rubbing together. On the cracked earth, a single brittle stalk of a dead plant stood as a monument to a world that had forgotten what life was. A desperate, primal hunger burned in the eyes of a female Homo habilis named Anya. Her skin was tight over her cheekbones, her lips cracked and bleeding. The world shimmered in the rising heat. Every shadow held a threat, every gust of wind a promise of nothingness. Her stomach was a hollow, grinding pain. This was not the noble struggle of a hunter, but the agonizing crawl of a survivor on the brink. Her thin, trembling hands clutched a crude stone tool. A single drop of sweat, thick with dirt, rolled down her temple. Her gaze was fixed on something just out of frame, something that promised survival, but at a cost she had not yet dared to consider. They found a shallow cave as the sun began its final, agonizing descent. The air inside was cooler, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something old and musty. The world outside was consumed by an eerie, purple twilight. The stars, once a source of wonder and guidance, were now just cold, indifferent pinpricks of light in a vast, uncaring void. Inside the cave, the clan huddled together, a small knot of misery and silence. The only sounds were the slow, rhythmic breathing of the truly exhausted and the occasional dry cough. Anya held Kale close, his small body trembling not from cold, but from weakness. She ran a hand over his cheek, his skin dry and feverish. His eyes were half closed, and he no longer asked for food. His silence was a scream in her mind. Her own hunger had become a dull, constant throb, but the pain of watching her son waste away was a sharp, unrelenting blade. She looked across the small cavern at Zaro. The clan leader sat apart, his head bowed, his broad shoulders slumped. He was the strongest among them, but even his strength was a flickering candle flame in a hurricane. He was burdened by the weight of their lives, the terrible responsibility of leading them into a future that seemed to hold no hope. Just as the last vestiges of daylight disappeared, a low, rasping sound emanated from the darkest corner of the cave. It was the sound of a living thing, a choked, wet gurgle. The clan members stiffened, their eyes wide with fear and anticipation. The sound came from the oldest woman in the clan, a frail figure named Ella, who had been fading for days. Her breathing was shallow and uneven, her eyes glassy. It was clear she was dying. The others watched, their faces a mask of stone. But Anya saw something else, a new, terrible kind of hunger flicker in their eyes. It was a look that had nothing to do with empathy and everything to do with survival. Anya held Kale tighter, her mind racing. She knew what was happening. She had seen it in the dying gaze of the stranger in the grotto. She had seen it in Zaro's eyes. And now she saw it in the collective, desperate stare of her clan. The thought was a vile, monstrous thing, a primal taboo that had never been spoken aloud. But silence in this desperate time was louder than any word. They were all thinking it. The moment of decision was approaching. The line between humanity and pure animalistic survival was blurring, dissolving in the face of absolute despair. Suddenly, Ella's body went still. Her shallow breathing ceased. A heavy silence descended upon the cave, broken only by the whimpering of a small child. The clan members remained frozen, staring at the motionless body of the elder. Anya felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. She knew what would happen next. This was the moment. The line had been crossed without a word. They had been starving, but now a morbid, terrifying sense of relief spread through the air. Anya felt sick to her core. Her gaze met Zaro's, and in his hollow eyes she saw not shame, but a terrible, grim resolve. He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, and walked toward the body. Anya knew that she and her son had to participate in this terrible act, or they would be cast out. This was a new, frightening form of community, born of desperation and the darkest corners of their shared humanity. The cave, once a place of silent, aching misery, was now a scene of grim, unnatural activity. The small, crackling fire in the center of the cavern cast long, dancing shadows, turning the hunched figures of the clan into monstrous, distorted shapes. The air, already heavy with the scent of damp earth, was now thick with a new, horrifying aroma, the faint metallic scent of blood and the sickly sweet smell of cooking flesh. It was a smell that twisted Anya's stomach, a visceral rebellion against the desperate act she was being forced to witness. Anya sat with her back to the fire, Kale huddled against her chest. She could not bring herself to look at the scene unfolding behind her. The sounds, however, were impossible to ignore. The tearing of sinew, the low, guttural sounds of hungry people finally finding relief, the sickening crack of bone. It was not the sound of a shared feast, but of a terrible, quiet desperation. She felt a deep, profound shame. This was not how they were meant to be. This was not who they were. But the brutal reality of their situation had stripped them of their dignity, their humanity. They were reduced to animals, driven by a single, insatiable need. Aya, another young mother in the clan, sat across from her. Her eyes were fixed on the fire, a haunted, empty look in their depths. A small piece of cooked meat was clutched in her hand. She did not eat it. She simply stared at it, her knuckles white. Anya knew what she was feeling. It was the same conflict, the mind screaming in protest, the body begging for relief. The two women shared a silent, terrible understanding, a shared burden of revulsion and necessity. Suddenly, Zaro's voice, low and rough, cut through the quiet. He was speaking to her. "Anya," he said. "Eat." Anya turned, her eyes meeting his. He held a small, charred piece of meat out to her. Her stomach cramped with a new kind of pain, a moral agony. She looked at the small piece of flesh and then at Cal's face, pale and drawn in the flickering firelight. He was watching her, his small, listless eyes holding a question she could not bear to answer. The hunger, a beast she had been trying to tame, roared to life within her, an undeniable, savage need. The shame was a terrible weight, but the fear of losing her son was heavier still. She had to eat. She had to survive. For Kale. With a trembling hand, she took the meat. It was warm, and the heat seeped into her cold, empty stomach. It was a vile thing, born of a monstrous act, but it was also life. As she chewed, a wave of guilt and self-loathing washed over her, a bitter taste far worse than the foul flavor in her mouth. She looked up at Zorro, and his face was grim. He did not look at her with pride or satisfaction, but with a terrible, shared understanding. They were all complicit. The terrible pact had been made. There was no turning back now. The first terrible meal provided a brief, fragile reprieve. A flicker of energy returned to the clan, a temporary escape from the gnawing pain of starvation. But the horror of what they had done lingered, a shadow in the depths of their eyes. They no longer spoke. They moved in a silent, haunted procession, each person isolated in their own private hell of guilt and shame. Anya walked with her head bowed, her hands still clasped in Cal's. He was stronger now, his steps a little more confident, but the light had not returned to his eyes. He had seen the truth of their new existence, and the knowledge was a poison that would never leave him. The landscape was an eternal wasteland of red earth and bleached bones. The wind, once a gentle whisper, was a cruel, mocking laugh that carried the dust of a dead world. They were following Zorro, but their destination was a mystery. They moved with the silent, desperate purpose of scavengers, their senses attuned to the faintest hint of life, the slightest promise of water. But there was nothing. The world was empty. The sun, a burning fist in the sky, seemed to be their only constant companion. One evening, they found a small grove of ancient trees, their leaves dry and rustling like paper. It was a small sanctuary in a world of desolation. As darkness fell, a new sound emerged from the woods. It was not a predator's cry, but something far more chilling. Whispers, low, sibilant sounds that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. The clan huddled together, their eyes wide with fear. The whispers spoke of things lost, of a time of plenty, of a great calamity that had consumed the world. They spoke of the desperate things people did to survive, the lines they crossed, the monstrous acts they committed. Anya felt a cold dread tighten in her chest. The whispers were not just sounds. They were their own thoughts made manifest. The unspoken horror of the past days had found a voice. An ethereal judgment had followed them. One of the young men in the clan, a boy named Elon, began to tremble violently. He clutched his head, his eyes squeezed shut, trying to block out the terrible sounds. "It's a curse," he whispered, his voice thin with terror. "We are cursed." Zorro, his face a grim mask, stood up. "Silence," he commanded, his voice raw with exhaustion. "It is the wind. It is nothing." But his eyes, as they darted nervously into the darkness, told a different story. He, too, heard the whispers. He knew they were not a curse, but the ghost of their own conscience, the terrible knowledge of what they had become. The whispers were a constant torment, a psychological predator far more dangerous than any beast. They were the sound of their own humanity, dying slowly, agonizingly in the darkness. The whispers followed them for days, a constant, low murmur that was a phantom pain in their minds. The physical hunger had returned, a more brutal, savage beast than before. The meager sustenance of the terrible feast was a distant memory. The clan was once again a group of gaunt, staggering figures, their steps heavy with a new kind of exhaustion, the weight of their sins. They were no longer just starving, they were tormented. Elon, the young man who had first spoken of the curse, was now delirious, mumbling incoherently, his eyes wide with fever. One afternoon, as the sun beat down with its usual cruelty, They came upon a sight that brought a gasp of mingled hope and terror to their lips. An abandoned village. The crude shelters, made of bone and mud, were scattered on a small rise. The air was thick with the scent of dried blood and decay, but there were no bodies. The place was a ghostly, silent testament to a life that had once been. Zaro, his face grim with suspicion, motioned for them to approach slowly. As they entered the village, they found a few scattered tools, a broken spearhead, a chipped rock, but there was no food. The shelters were empty, the cooking pits cold. The only thing they found of note was a small, well-hidden storage pit. They dug with desperate hands, their fingers clawing at the hard earth. Inside, they found nothing but the withered remains of a few tubers and a single, rotting gourd. Despair settled over them, a thick blanket of defeat. It was not a place of salvation, but a tomb of failed hope. Then, Kale, who had been standing silent and watchful, pointed to a large rock on the edge of the village. Scrawled on its surface, a primitive drawing had been etched. It was a crude depiction of a clan, huddled together, their faces gaunt. Above them, a monstrous figure with teeth and claws, but in the shape of a man, stood over them. The drawing was a silent, chilling story. A story of a clan that had descended into madness and violence. A story of a beast that had been born of desperation and devoured its own. Anya felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at Zaro. His eyes were fixed on the drawing, and in them she saw a flicker of recognition. This was not just a story. It was a warning. The village was a mirror of their own possible future, a grim prophecy of what they could become if the hunger consumed them entirely. The whispers returned, a chorus of ghostly voices, but this time they were not of a distant curse, but of a present terrible truth. They were not just a clan anymore. They were a collection of walking shadows, a monstrous entity on the brink of self-destruction. The revelation of the drawing broke something within the clan. The silent, shared horror was replaced by a frantic, unspoken fear. They scattered, each person driven by a primal need to escape the grim prophecy of the abandoned village. They could no longer bear to be near each other, to see their own potential for monstrousness reflected in the eyes of their kin. Anya, holding Cal's hand, walked away from the village, not looking back. She did not know where she was going, only that she had to get away, to sever the terrible connection that bound her to the others. She walked for what felt like an eternity, the sun a burning weight on her shoulders. Cal was a heavy burden in her arms, his breathing shallow, his body limp with exhaustion. She stumbled, fell, and rose again, her mind a blank slate of pure, unadulterated need. She was no longer a human. She was just a mother, a beast driven by the sole purpose of protecting her young. The whispers had stopped. The shame was a distant echo. There was only the heat, the dust, and the precious, fragile weight of her son. Then, as the sun began its descent, she saw it. A glint of green, a vibrant splash of life in the endless red. It was a small, hidden spring, a pool of water tucked away in a hollow of rocks. Around it, small, stubborn plants grew, their leaves a deep, healthy green. The sight was a miracle, a celestial gift in a world of torment. Anya stumbled towards it, her body trembling with a mixture of disbelief and relief. She knelt at the edge of the water, her hands scooping up the cool, clear liquid. She drank, the water a blessed balm to her cracked lips and parched throat. She then offered it to Cale, who drank with a desperate, life-giving thirst. As he drank, a small sound escaped his lips, a low, contented hum. His eyes, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, held a flicker of life, a spark of the boy she knew. Anya looked at her reflection in the water. Her face was gaunt, her eyes still haunted, but something had changed. The monstrous hunger was gone. The whispers were silent. The terrible pact had been broken. The promise of life had offered a path to redemption, a way back from the edge of the abyss. As the sun set, a cool breeze came, carrying the scent of damp earth and new life. Anya and Kale sat by the spring, a small solitary island of hope in a vast empty ocean of death. The past days were a terrible dream, a dark chapter in the story of their survival. But they had survived, and they had done so without a final, terrible act of self-annihilation. They had found a way to escape the curse, not with a vengeful fury, but with a quiet, desperate act of faith. The world was still a brutal, unforgiving place. The journey was far from over, but for now, they were safe. The dawn of a new, uncertain but hopeful day was on the horizon, and they would be there to greet it.